Good evening. I'm Cynthia Hoven, and I want to welcome you to these next lectures on the ongoing nature of the human being courses that I've been giving. And this series is the four elements in the human being. As we begin, I would very much like to see your names in the chat. And I'd also like to ask you where you're coming from, because I know that we have some people coming from Asia, we have some from India, we have some from Malaysia, and I don't know where else. I know that we have some also from Mexico, possibly Argentina. So if you would introduce yourselves in the chat and tell me where you're coming from, that would be wonderful. So I know that many of you got my my email from yesterday, in which I gave you the titles of this upcoming course. So let me begin by reiterating them. As you know, I have 4 lectures coming up. And as you probably know, these are matched with the Eurythmy webinars that I'm giving in the morning, in which we're working on the 4 elements of eurythmy, of 4 elements of nature in a eurythmy practice. So if you're not signed up for them, you might want to consider doing so. So the 4 lecture titles are these. This evening, we'll talk about spirit and matter, the relationship between the two, because that's an essential element in understanding the 4 elements. Where did they come from? Next week, I'll talk about the 4 elements and the natural world, especially the 4 elements in plants, the 4 elements in weather. We'll talk about 4 elements in the seasons, and also about elemental beings. The next week, the 3rd week, we'll talk about 4 elements and the human being. And that will include our 4 bodies, our 4 constitutional areas. It will give an overview of occult or spiritual embryology. And I would love to do that in depth, but that's a whole course in itself. We'll speak about the process of digestion and how we digest the 4 elements. I'll talk about what we mean when we speak of the human phantom, our sacred, ancient, essential body. We'll talk about the 4 temperaments. And then in the last week, we'll talk about the 4 elements and the 4 ethers, which are actually an essential part of any study of the elements. And we'll talk about what we call the etherization of the blood, and also the transmutation, the movement between spirit and matter. So you see, with this, we have the buildup of the material we're going to be working on. So as I said in the email that many of you got yesterday, this is the time of year when I come alive. As I've said, summer is hard for us here in California. And by temperament, I'm not one of those people who does well in the heat of the summer. Somehow it's too much for me, too much out there. I'm an autumn person, and I feel like I'm coming back into myself in this season. I become more inwardly awake, even as around us, the processes of nature are changing. The days are becoming shorter. The nights are becoming richer, more stars. As I said, also the forest fires are coming to an end. The temperature is cool, and so grateful that we have some big rain coming in to California right now. Very grateful to be celebrating that. And then we are also moving away from the autumn equinox. And the autumn equinox is the time when we celebrate the courage that we need to go into the dark time of the year as a real life metaphor for the courage that we need to go into the dark places of our inner being. And you see already there what a correlation there is between our own personal experiences in our soul and the experiences of the natural world. So we had the season, the 4 weeks of acknowledging the spirit of autumn, an archangelic being, Michael, guiding us and inspiring us for this season. And now we're coming towards the end of October and November, which is in so many cultures experienced as a time of death, the time of death preceding the movement towards the winter solstice, which we will then acknowledge through the season of Advent, which is once again an immersion in the 4 elements, but we'll come to that in a little bit. So at the end of October, those of you who are living in this culture know that we'll celebrate Halloween. What is that? That's a time when, first of all, the Celtic nations experienced or celebrated Samhain, the festival halfway between the equinox and the solstice, right in between there, Samhain, and it's considered a threshold time, a threshold between light or between the outer world and the inner world. It's as if a spiritual door opens, as it does at the other 4 Celtic festival times. A door opens, and in this time it's said that the spirits of the underworld, sometimes also it's said the spirits of the dead, even in the Celtic cultures, are free to cross the boundaries between the sense world and the super sensible world and are able to interact with us, speak with us, possibly cause some dark mischief. And then, perhaps in response, we have what was set up as the church festivals, All Souls Day and All Saints Day. And those were set up by the Catholic Church, you may know, but other cultures also have put these festivals to honor and remember the dead in the season, in the month of November. And so in this season, I find myself often thinking about death. What is that? What does it mean to come into a body as a spiritual being? And what does it mean to die out of a body? And let me say that in a way appropriate to our current course here. What does it mean to connect myself with the 4 elements, with the elements in which I bathe myself as a human being? And what does it mean to dissociate myself from them at the moment of death? And so let me in this moment speak a poem that at some point in the future I'll also do with you in eurythmy. This is a poem that I love to teach in many classes, and it is an unknown author, but I think it's a Celtic author. I'm certain it's not an anthroposophically inspired poet, or we would know that person's name, but I suspect it's an ancient Celtic poem because we have the elements referred to in it. So please listen up. The poem says, I was born of the shining of distant stars. I drew their beams with me from afar. I was born of the gold of the radiant sun, of the light of the world ere the earth begun. Born I was of the silver eye, of the guardian moon keeping watch on high. Born of the flame's intensity, born of the wild winds roaming free, born of the waves that lap the shore and the rock that hides the glistening ore. Born I was from out of the whole. I bear the world within my soul. Dear friends, that poem has for me the entire journey of creation. I was born of the stars and the sun, born of the moon. They were part of this journey of incarnation. And then I clothe myself in fire, air, water, and earth. And then this body grew around me until I was ready to be born. Wonderful, wonderful journey. And then the last words, born I was from out of the hole. I bear the world within my soul. And so we have here the question, what does it mean to wear a body? And how did this body come into being? Not just in the mother womb, but altogether the materiality of the world. And there we're confronted with one of the ancient questions that philosophers and scientists have asked. What is the relationship with spirit and matter? And people who are philosophers struggle with saying, if I look at something, how does it actually get into my mind? How is this possible? What is this threshold between the two? And in the thoughts that I'll develop tonight, I want to say actually, spirit and matter are the same thing. They're just different levels of density, if you will. So that's the journey that we'll be taking. What are these four elements? They are definitely not the periodic table of hydrogen and helium and so on, those 104 or 108 or how many we have nowadays, elements. These are stages of elements, stages of density, states of being. They are fire, air, water, and earth. Surely you're aware of these names. They're very familiar to most of us. With a small nod, I want to make here to the Chinese mythology, which has 5 elements, and that's used, for instance, in acupuncture. So just a small nod to that and say, I'm quite conscious of those 5 elements, and they refer to processes, a little bit different from these 4 element states that has been a tradition through the Western cultures. Perhaps if it's a question, we can just go a little deeper into the 5 elements later, but that's not the Western tradition. So these states of being are inside of us. We have earth in our bones, we have water in our fluids, air in our lungs, and there is an ever-changing flow of activity between the 4 of them. And these 4, just very, very, and the very first level of looking at this, we have elements that are more filled with levity, ascending. I write here cosmic, and we have earthly elements. And if you have patience, we'll be developing these thoughts in the hour to come. And ascending elements include, of course, fire. And what else? You must know the answer. And the other one that ascends is air. These are rising. And then we have the descending elements that are more heavy, so to speak. And those are, you will know, water and earth. Oh, they're going down. We worked with these a little bit in our eurythmy class on Monday. And I, even where you're sitting, if you would like to just have a little feeling with that we said with the fire elements, we feel this flaming upwards. With the air, we find this dissolution upwards. And then I'd like to just ask you to try to feel what happens when we work with a water feeling. We have to become more dense. And when I invoke water in my being, I have to let everything inside myself acknowledge gravity, not yet the gravity of the physical material, but I become viscous. I'm no longer popping up. I am viscous water. Water relates to gravity. And then earth. Earth is that which comes to a solid form and a stop. So if you would just see if perhaps you're the type for whom this movement experience will help. Let's do that one more time. Fire and air, weightless. And now let everything kind of heavy, water and earth. Yeah, play with that in the week to come, if you will. So as my next step, I would very much like to share my screen with you for a moment and show you. Have you got it? Yes, you can see this now. Let me just take this one off my screen. A little bit tricky. I'll just keep this here. This is what is called the cosmic egg. Let's see what sense you can make out of it. This was a vision of a nun, Hildegard of Bingen, and she was a mystic nun who had a lot of visions, increasing visions as she got older. And what we're seeing here, let me see if I can make this in. I don't, I'll just keep with this view. When I looked her up on the internet, I found that there are about 20 pictures that she envisioned. I'm sure she had many more, but this one she called the world egg. And I'm bringing this one to you because this was shown to her in a sacred picture as the picture of the four elements. We see here, this here in the center is the center of the egg, the microcosm. And this is the whole egg. And this whole egg this is what is going to be hatched. This is perhaps the universe out here, the square. In the egg, we see stars descending, but the stars are in fire, the cosmic element. The stars are in the fire, and then inside the fire, we're going to see air because we have these winds here. And then inside the winds, we have this blue field of water. And inside this, we have the circle. The circle is the earth element. And the earth element itself contains, once again, the microcosmic image of the macrocosm. Reflect for a moment on the poem that I spoke in the beginning. When I said I was born of the stars, I was born of the sun. Here is the sun. I was born of the moon. And then I was born of the four elements. Inside this egg, we have the green hills here on the outside, and then right here in the center. That represents to her earth element. And then we have the watery element, this. And then in the center, also a water egg or water wave. And then we have just a little bit here of the light and air element. And then this black, she said, is the fire element to her. So I bring this because this understanding of the fourfold elements is an ancient understanding. And we're going to take a time to go through different mythologies. Hildegard von Bingen had another image, and in that image, she showed a human being at the center of the universe. And in that, she showed this human being had fire in their bones and air was coming out of the person's mouth in their breath, and water was flowing through the person's veins, and earth is in the bones. That is, the earth was the hard part of the bones, and inside of the bones is the marrow. And you know that marrow is where new life is born. So wherever fire occurs, it indicates new and primal energy, the energy of rebirth. So this is one of the threads that we're following, that fire will always represent for us rebirth, original fire, the original creative process. All right, coming back now, just a second, let me press a couple of buttons here, and I have to get my view straightened out. Excuse me for a second here as I do that. Thank you. All right. So as I said, spirit and matter are actually one at different levels of density. And at this point, we must introduce also the concept of the alchemical processes, because those are intertwined as necessities. Spirit there are three alchemical processes. One is called sulf, related to the word sulfur. One is called mercury, and one is called sol. And the process of sol is always the process of condensing toward the earth. So we'll build up much more of this process in the next half hour. But when spirit becomes matter, it descends, it solidifies. And when spirit rises, when matter rises back to spirit, we call that sulf, related to the word sulfur. That's the process of sublimation. We will be looking at that next week, at how we find this in the plants, for instance. The root nature of the plant is the sol nature, and the ascending nature of the plant is the sulf nature. And in between is the process part of it, which is called mercury, which is constant movement. And the mercury process will always be changing from one to another. We have that in the seasons of the year. In the plant, we have the mercury in the leaves. For instance, when life rises, and the falling is when more matter happens. So the alchemical process is always involved in the conversation between fire, air, water, and earth, cosmic, spirit, and earthly. So the next thought that is essential here is how much beingness is in these different manifestations. So the cosmic nature is more easily attached to cosmic consciousness, divine consciousness, original consciousness. And earthly is no longer so immediately accessible to God. That's what we're going to talk about in a moment. We speak of, so this is not just a mechanical process. Cosmic touches greater beings, and beings are not present in the same way in the earthly matter because it has become hardened and contracted. Now, as we talk about how matter came into being, there are two doorways for this. One of these doorways is the doorway of the philosophical bent, which is where we're going to start tonight, saying, how does the spiritual world, God, become matter? And the other way is the phenomenological study that says, I behold a plant. How can I see in the plant the spiritual nature out of which it was born? And here it's time to already quote Rudolf Steiner, who's the inspirer behind these classes and behind Eurythmy, who says, the sense perceptible world has its roots in the supersensible world. I'll do that again. The sense perceptible world has its roots in the supersensible world. All of the things that we're seeing around us, and initially was just refer here to the natural things, the trees and the mountains and the waters, those were all born out of the supersensible world. And this happened in the great course of cosmic evolution and happens again in all of our dealings on the earth, in the way that the plants are growing, in the way that the seasons are changing, and so on. And in fact, we can ask then, how is that still happening? When a child is born, spirit enters the world of matter. Where else does spirit enter matter? I mean, from pure thought coming down through fire and air and water, where else does spirit, how deeply can we get matter? When we say a prayer, before we eat a meal, we can sanctify matter. Or what about if we just strike them or use a cigarette lighter? That flame is not necessarily very sacred, but if we light a candle in sacred ceremony, in ritual, then that fire will have much more of a being presence. So we find this perspective in many of the mythologies and the legends of ancient peoples, and that's where we're going to linger for the next minutes here. Many mythologies say that God spoke the world into being. And I'm going to go through these different mythologies and then take us to the work that Rudolf Steiner did with explaining that in more detail. Rudolf Steiner felt that his task, his life work, was to explain the relationship between spirit and matter, not using mythological language, but using concepts in a way that the modern human being, you and me, could understand, because we are living in probably the most materialistic age that has ever been on the earth. And our job is living down here in this earth world to find thoughts that really can keep us in a living relationship to spirit. So we're going to head towards looking at this book, Occult Science, which is one of my very favorite books in anthroposophy. Last year, I did a course with many of you speaking about human and cosmic evolution, and the book Occult Science was the inspiration behind it, the guiding thoughts. But before we get to pure anthroposophical thinking, let me begin with a few examples. I want to look back at the ancient Norse mythologies, for instance, in which we have, for instance, the mythologies which are recited in the Edda, one of the ancient Norse texts. And they could imagine, as this world came into being, it was done out of a whole host of beings, elemental beings, gnomes and giants who would hammer and chisel and so on. Is that part of your world picture? Not necessarily. But people in ancient times explained the world that way, and perhaps they were more right than we can acknowledge in our present time. Can we imagine a world in which God was one with creation and had these beings in service to him, made the world. Let's look, I want to look at the indigenous people. We know the Hopis and the Pueblo Indians. I can just refer to their mythologies, but there are more. And they speak about multiple cycles of creation. And they, for which are the foundations for our present familiar world. They spoke indeed of fire, air, water, and earth as the four stages of creation. There was a vision of the becoming human being. And it says in the first world that was created, the human being was in a state of fire. He received the gift of spiritual warmth. He, she, the human being, received spiritual warmth. In the second stage, the human being received the breath of life, fire, air. In the third stage, the human being received the stream of life, as even this life that flows then later, a watery way through the blood and the bodily fluids. And in the fourth stage, the human received his flesh. So you recognize already the fire, the air, the water, and the earth. We can turn then also to an ancient sacred Hebrew text, the Kabbalah, And in the language of the Kabbalah, God is characterized perhaps best as an artist. And if we can imagine an artist who is going to create something. And in the first stage, the creator hasn't made it yet. He is one, she is one with the creation. Through that stage is called the emanation. And in the second stage, the creator separates this idea and starts to put this into motion. But it's not perfected yet. So the creator has got this idea and starts to make it. And then in this third step, the creator withdraws a bit and looks back at it and starts to see if that creation can manifest what the creator really wanted to do with it, stage 3. And in the fourth step, the creator steps even further back and lets that thing become independent. The creator has made the pot, the painting, whatever, and won't touch it anymore. This was, as I said, the Kabbalistic view of creation, and that's going to match up with what we have in the anthroposophical worldview. The creator thinks of something, starts to put energy into it, starts to make it more independent, and then steps way back and lets that thing have free will, if you will. And every one of those steps is a further condensation of matter. So once again, the question we're following, how does spirit condense into matter? I'll take one more step here, ancient Greek mythology. And the Greeks considered, it was common understanding that there was a primordial being out of which everything came into being. And this primordial being placed the world outside of him herself, even as the Kabbalistic view did. And this was the first step towards creating the earth body. In 500 BC, the pre-Socratic philosopher, Heraclitus, said that the physical world was born out of fire. Right here, this cosmic element. And he's going to say it it dropped down, it solidified into fire. And he said this fire is not originally a visible flame, but it's a spiritual being. So can we imagine God, spirit, as a being of fire? And this being then incubates creation and creates the so-called world egg. The world egg, which is what Hildegard saw in her vision. Fire, air, water, and earth came into being. Fire was warm and dry. Air was warm and damp. Water was moist and cold. Earth was dry and cold. And we'll deal more with that next week. And Heraclitus then, already thinking in this alchemical way, said, all of creation is this process of rarefication and densification, this mercurial process of rising and falling. And please remember, at that time of evolution, this was not a theory. This was experienced. People could experience the changing life forces and the coming into manifestation of beings. So as a next step, we could look at the Bible story of Genesis, but we're not quite ready for that, because before we do Genesis, I want to talk about Rudolf Steiner's understanding of creation. I imagine that some of you have studied that already, and I think for quite a few of you, this could be new. So I'll erase this board. And Rudolf Steiner's talking will go through these 4 stages of fire, air, water, and earth. And as I said, Rudolf Steiner considered it his task not to just ask people to have faith in what the shaman said or the ancient tradition said or mythology, but that we can actually follow these stages as a thought process. One can recreate them in the laboratory alchemically, or even making some medicines. And one can practice observing that in the plant world. But then he goes into it in so much more detail. Rudolf Steiner speaks then of this cycle, 4 stages of evolution, even as we saw with the Hopis in the Kabbalah and so on. The first stage is fire. The entire universe was, the entire creation was fire. Then air. Let me get some other colors here. Fire, air, water, earth. Second stage was air. Green for water. I hope you can see these colors. I know they don't always come across well on Zoom, but I hope so. Water and earth. And above it all, being, the divine being, who had the idea, the artistic idea of creating and creating a free being. And this being, this universe, would not be free until it was set far enough apart from source that source would not interfere with its being. That's us. That's what we're living through now. Let's work towards that. Divine being had ideas or archetypes, and these belong to the cosmic pole. And I kick that? Yeah. Now I must beg us to think that this happened long, long ago, before Genesis, before the Big Bang, so long ago that we don't have any possibility. It's not measurable in Earth time in any sense. Creator, before time, out of pure thought, Creator existed as fire. I want you to ask yourself, where do we have that original fire in us still? Creator was pure fire and didn't hold on to this fire, but let it ray forth. And we call this first phase of evolution, ancient Saturn. And if I were to draw this, could only draw a ball, a universe that's nothing but warmth. And now we must think warmth is absolute presence of being. And I want us to remember, I'm not just telling about mythology here, but we're talking about how can we deeply understand the elements? How can we deeply understand what happens to matter in a plant at the height of summer? What happens when fragrances are sublimated and rise? What is fire as it finds its home in the spiritual ideas and spiritual being? So we're really going to crawl under the skin of the four elements and say, in fire, we have original being. And in this story, and in the Hopis and the Pueblos, and, this is where, excuse me, I have my computer battery is going to go out. And so I'm going to have to do a little magic here. And you'll just, Michelle, hold on to my people, would you?
Absolutely. We're here together.
Okay, excellent. Let me plug this in and be sure that I don't lose anything here.
We can wait patiently.
Excellent. And see if the battery is charging or not. Using significant power battery. Let me see. It doesn't look like it's taking in battery right now or taking in source. This means, there we go. Whoop. If I can keep it plugged in. Nope. I don't know if you hear it when it's beeping. That means the battery is connecting here. There. Can you hear me?
Yes. Well, talk first.
Okay. It looks like we're going to be okay here. Our source, the adapter, is plugged in. I think we'll be okay. All right. The second stage is when the creator lets the fire become more dense. So the creator says, okay, I've got my idea. Let me work on it out there a little bit. Creator, that means original fire is standing back. Creator is holding him, her, itself as the creator, and now has created this piece of art out there. We name this air. Yeah, it's a different level of being. We call this ancient sun. Once again, that's happened far, far, far longer ago than we can imagine. But this is understanding that out of fire, there will be a densification of movement towards becoming more independent. And becoming more independent means becoming more complex, more articulated, and no longer as cold as original fire. And this is what we call air. So that universe would be this original fire and air. So I'll make that air here, but I'm going to make some more fire kind of around it. So there was, I hope you can imagine what I'm doing here. There was the godly beings, creator, who had put some of that original fire into process and then let some of that original fire start to become air. Where were we? Where was the earth? And if you hold that question, that will help to understand where we're going with this. We were there. We weren't the only ones that were there. Just as I said that in the Norse mythology, they spoke of there being many beings involved. So also we understand there are many different levels of consciousness. The highest consciousnesses perhaps are more like Sulph. They're very, very, very high. And lower consciousnesses are closer to Earth. Yeah, coming all the way down to angels and archangels. But in a moment, we'll also have to talk about elemental beings. A third stage, ancient moon. And if only we were together in a class, of course, I would say, can you imagine how that was? And of course, you would answer correctly that the creator God steps back a little bit further, and this creation begins to have its own energy, its own dynamic, its own life, if you will. And remember how we did in movement, fire, air, those were still states of being that God could wear, but water starts to become heavy, dense, viscous. This next phase starts to assert its independence. We were still there. So we had fire. Yes, you could do this too. I hope you have your own notepad at home. We had air. We had water. I'll make that here wavy. And yes, I will put the fire around the outside again as well. And I'll put some more air on the outside. I'm trying to show with that there's, in addition to the thoughts of air, where, if you will, God or spirit can live, there's also that which is becoming more earthly, which will become the natural world that we live in. Yeah. And the fourth step. And now this is where, the fourth step, where the story of Genesis begins. Actually, a little bit after the so-called Big Bang could be identified as happening. And that would be what we call present day Earth. Deliberately chose black for that. The picture you can definitely do yourself. Fire in the middle. And the air. And the water. Yes. And earth. But this was surrounded by this zone where God is still living. God is still, even now, fully present as being. Spirit, light, and air in their essence still exist as thoughts of God. Spirit, water, and life exist. But this indicates what happened in Genesis. The book of Genesis in the body, or in the Bible, where it is said that God created heaven and earth first, and the earth was without any form. This whole new black universe where everything stopped was without form, chaotic. It had no shape to it. And God, Spirit, divine being, had to make it, shape it before setting it free. So Spirit took this earthly matter and started to work it like clay and said, okay, I'll begin by making heaven and earth. And then the Genesis says, the Spirit of God moved upon this field of chaos. We have the Hebrew word tohu wabohu, that means the chaos. And it means not only chaos, it means the chaos was astonished. It was as if the world, after all of this original fire, said, wait a minute, I am now stuck in this black earth element. Let me say that again. This original fire has been developing. This original fire is now being asked to get compressed into a fixed form. And it's chaotic in the beginning. This fixed form, this is a hard way to be, to exist. It was chaotic. And then God had to, Creator God, started to shape it, bringing, formative forces into it, thereby creating this world of nature. And that meant then creating, again, heaven and earth, creating day and night, separating the water, the heavenly water from the earthly water, then creating all of the animals. And then on the sixth day of creation, the human being appeared on the scene. Now the four elements have been created. These are earth, still being worked on over the course of millennia, billennia, stones and mountains and crystals, and in the bodies of human beings and of the vertebrates, the bones and the teeth. And then the waters of the ocean, the waters of rivers, the waters of rain and clouds, and the fluids inside of skin, inside body, water, and air. Air outside, winds. And again, at this point, we're ready to enliven our sense of what it means that not all fire became heavy and watery. Fire is still free in the form of air to expand, wind, and then it comes and visits those beings who have the capacity for inhalation and exhalation. God breathed the breath of life into the human being, and we became living beings. And through our breath, we're in constant conversation with our periphery. And then fire in the marrow of our bones. And then fire in the world around us, in the volcanoes, in the heats of the earth, and so on. And then we have the story that even at that time, earth was not as hard as it is now, because this process of evolution and cooling and separating from original spirit is still happening. And the earth is becoming colder. The earth is becoming harder. The earth is becoming more rigid. Geologists say that. Geologists say the earth is dying. And I can see it. Eurythmy teachers have been saying that. That's when I first heard about that. My teacher said 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, the eurythmy students could move much more easily, but now people are more rigid. It's as if when spirit is not enlivening the body, it becomes more sclerotic. It's the cause of sclerotizing illnesses. And I've seen it in the decades since I've become a eurythmist too. People are becoming estranged from their bodies, just as the earth is becoming estranged from spirit. And our question is, what is our access to spirit light in the world? And this brings us to really deep spiritual questions. It's really the question of esoteric Christianity, which I'm not quite ready to go into yet, but that's the picture of through all of this, the animal kingdoms were created. The animal kingdoms, the lower the invertebrates, well, even before that, you know, the starfishes and even the plankton and very primitive sea forms, urchins, and so on. And then rising into the amphibians and then rising into the reptiles. Those are all more complicated embryological forms. We'll talk about that when we get to embryology a little bit. But the more complex an animal's reproductive system is, the more we recognize that that creature appeared later in the process of Earth becoming. So the very soft-shelled animals are actually closer to plants or viruses and so on. I'm not going there. They're almost not alive, but there are some animals that are hardly animals. They don't have sense organs yet. They don't breathe yet. And then we get into more and more complex animals that laid eggs. Those are animals that appeared later on the Earth's geological timeline. And then we get to mammals, where the egg was actually laid not only in nature, but inside a body. And then, and we get to the primates and eventually to human, which has the most complex of all embryological forms, which is already one of our clues when we want to understand what it means that we're not merely higher primates. We are something different. We have a body that was created to have a brain and to stand upright and so on. But we'll come into that. So we have these kingdoms of nature that appeared on this becoming earth. We have then some manifestations of pure spirit, cosmos, that have become hard and cold. They have only earth bodies, like the minerals. Where is water? We have water in the rains and the oceans and the bodies of water, but we also have plants, which have their own individuated water bodies. Plants are earth element plus water element. Are you there? So there's the elements in the environment, and there's a whole kingdom of nature, which is carrying that element of earth and water in themselves. Then we have, of course, air in the environment, expansive. And then we have creatures who have worked on developing an earth, a water, and an air body. And that air body manifests in creatures being able to breathe, but it also means in that they can breathe in, they can also have sensations. That's the next level of study. of course. And then we have, and this is, if there's one picture that I want you to continue to work on for this whole week or longer, there is also a kingdom that appears on this earth that has the original fire, and that is the human kingdom. And the human kingdom is that fire that is not only an organic fire, but the fire of your inmost ideals, your core, your self perception of spirit inside you. And I would say, with all love towards the animals, they don't have that same self perception of spirit inside them. They have perhaps a sensation of intimate connection to spirit, a sensation that spirit is all that they are. They are nature and they're just flowing according to divine will. And the humans, we are fire living inside air and water and earth, but we have this fire in us. And this fire, of course, lives in our bones and so on. I place it, I feel it in my heart when my heart is deeply warmed by someone or something. I feel it in my heart when I say, who am I really? Huh? And then it also manifests through my deeds, through my will, which is, my creation. So with this, we lay the foundation for the studies of elemental beings. I want to say in our time, matter has become very hard. And where does that come from? And that's one more little thread to follow that we'll pick up again later on. But I said, coming all the way through this, there's not only a godly being, but the godly being has other beings working below them, other manifestations, like light that has been split into many colors, if you will. And the beings that are closest to us, I promise I'll come back to this, but the ones that are closest to us are the angels. And also close to them are the archangels, and also close to them are the archai. And they're quite involved in our human journey. And higher beings than that are more like the directors from outside. But the ones that I just mentioned are closer into us. And we have the picture that these beings have gifted creation with their, I would have to call them their offspring. Their offspring have become the elemental beings. Their offspring have become the elemental beings. I will give you the word that Rudolf Steiner uses. Can you imagine blowing up a balloon? And then if you've been to a circus, you've seen how you can kind of squeeze that balloon and you'll have a little part of the balloon that is, kind of independent, but it's connected to the original balloon. You call this in German, unusual word, you call it an Abschnürung, something that belongs to the original theme, but it's also cut off from it. And with that difficult concept, Steiner says, this is the source of the elemental beings. So that one level of the hierarchies has created earth elemental beings. That means that they have given away some of their selfness as a gift to God's creation so that earthliness can happen. So spirit condenses, distance itself, but still earth needed to be made out of something, not just electrons and atoms, but it builds upon a gift of one of the hierarchies. And we'll go into more depth. Water also is a manifestation of one of these hierarchies, and air also a manifestation of one of these hierarchies. And then fire, not. Fire is in a different way intimately connected to original beingness, to spirit, to the human being. And that's an elemental kingdom that we will carry with us into the future. So obviously that demands that we work on it a little bit more in the coming weeks. We'll get back to that. So let me speak now this poem that I spoke in the beginning once more, and then we have a few minutes for questions, if you will. So this poem. I was born of the shining of distant stars. I drew their beams with me from afar. I was born of the gold of the radiant sun, of the light of the world, ere the earth begun. Born I was of the silver eye of the guardian moon keeping watch on high. Born of the flame's intensity, born of the wild winds roaming free, born of the waves that lap the shore and the rock that hides the glittering ore. Born I was from out of the whole. I bear the world within my soul. Thank you. So, as I said, this evening would be a story about the origins of the four elements, which took us into a study of the alchemical process and the nature of the four elements. Next week, we'll be looking at the four elements in the natural world, in the kingdoms of nature, very much in the plants and in the elemental beings. And we'll see how far we can go with that, and in the seasons. So thank you very much. And I would like to invite you to take a couple of minutes and ask questions if you would like to. Thank you so much. Michelle.
Hello there.
Hello, Michelle.
So at this point, I think we've been intently listening.
Mm-hmm.
And at this point, we don't have questions yet. There we go.
All right.
Maybe
just
need to
just a couple minutes and see if they come.
Okay.
And let's hope it was clear.
You have given us lots to chew on for the week, and then we can anticipate adding on to that next week. Oh, here we go. Okay, so Judy asked, how are the elementals going to survive through the earth becoming so hard?
You know, in addition to the earth becoming hard, humans are treating the earth poorly. And I have heard it said by more than one people who understand the earth or the elemental beings, that the elemental beings, by feeling neglected, are suffering this hardening process very particularly. And they are also, because of cars and paving and electricity and what do I know, the electromagnetic waves, that the elementals are leaving and withdrawing. The healthy elementals are withdrawing to places where they can find refuge. And their leaving contributes even to us feeling that our environments are more harsh, more parched, less vital, less alive. And so we have these cascading problems that we are choosing more and more to become materialistic. That's going to have to stop at some point soon because this can't go on. And our becoming more materialistic means that the elementals are not finding a relationship to us. And then the elementals whom we do not serve appropriately are, in a sense, kidnapped, abandoned by us, and kidnapped by the mechanical forces. They become less than what they should be. We are actually allowing them to be abused and raped. So, for instance, we have this picture that when we look at a flower, we should make a practice at least of giving thanks to that flower, acknowledging the living beings inside it. And then Rita Steiner speaks of that specifically. When we die, we free that elemental being in a good sense. And if we don't, they become more changed to matter. So the more indifferent we are to the goodness of nature, to the living process of nature, the more indifferent we are, the deader nature becomes, and the more we condemn the elemental beings to suffer.
And Judy said, this is what is concerning me, the lack of love for the elementals. I tell everyone to say hello to the flowers, if only to silently embrace them.
Absolutely.
Leonard said, in the process of our fall, how did evil come in?
This is such a big question. Actually, we worked on that on the Michael webinars in the previous weeks. Evil lives there where something falls away from source and falls away and turns away from source. And turns away from source because it seeks its own ends instead of seeking to serve, to give thanks and gratitude back to source. I could say back to God, back to Creator, and instead says, I've got my own ideas and it doesn't matter to me if I disturb the whole universe in the process. This evil, we could also say, and it's part of the spiritual path to be able to endure paradoxes. And here's a paradox. We could also say that that paradox is the only thing that makes it possible for us to be free humans. Because we are this powerful spiritual being living in a place where Creator has said, you're on your own. If I anthropomorphize God, these words are the best words I can use to try to describe it. God says, do you know what? I would like to create beings and do an experiment and see if I give them all my power, but they have to find it. Let's see what they do. Let's see if they will create love out of freedom. And if they do that, I'll give them all the power of being world creators themselves. Hope you got that whole sentence. So God stood back and said, humans, you've got your bodies, you've got everything I can give you, you're on your own. But if I'm not going to control the game anymore, I have to also allow things that are not me to be present in your world. And you could say that's where evil came in, that there are beings who are, now here, carefully, maybe they're not innately evil, but they're not, in modern technology, going with the program. They are, at one point, Rudolf Steiner tries to explain this difficult concept and says they're living in the wrong kind of time. Like this being of hardening, who is called Ahriman, says, I want to do what is supposed to happen in the future. I want to do it now. I want to make all of wisdom just obey mechanical or the laws of independence. Just let me try to do that. He's working in time in the wrong way, not in obedience to this organic development. And this other being, whom we call Lucifer, says, humans, you just don't need to get involved in the earth. Stay with me, and you will have these wonderful, godly, cosmic experiences. Slow down. Just don't even get involved in matter. Stay with me. It's much nicer to just avoid this reality of the earth. So we, if you will, are spanned between these two polarities. Yeah, if you want to know more, I don't know, Leonard, have you seen the statue that is at the Goetheanum of the human being between too much lightness and too much darkness? And the statue is really a piece of art that says, we human beings stand between polarities, and in the balancing of the two of them, we become fully human.
Thank you. Okay, I'm not sure if we're out of time or if we can take one more question from Leonard. What do you think?
We can take this one. The elementals are also evolving. How could they evolve with the earth hardening? Every time something is created, elementals have to get pulled into it. So essentially, you've got also the elementals working in your dishwasher, elementals working in your car, elementals working in your computer. And the more humans work with these so-called sub-natural forces, atomic energy, electricity, and so on, the more we work with them, the more elementals are getting enchanted. That's a really good word to talk about them. They get enchanted into sub-natural states of being. How could they evolve? They're doing more things, but they're also getting tortured, as I said. How can they evolve? They are part of this mercurial process, the alchemical process. They should always come into nature, and then when something dies away, be lifted out of it. For instance, they're involved in every plant that they become root, and others are involved in the plant, in the leaves, and others are involved in the flowering, and so on. They're always, that's the alchemical, the mercurial process. Those are the lucky elementals who can change. The unlucky ones are the ones that are getting enchanted into hard matter. How can they evolve? It's our responsibility. We have to do that. And we're not done with our whole Earth evolution story until we have done goodness with them. We have a long future with those elementals. And I see Judy says they still dance on the farms, and I imagine you mean the biodynamic farms, flower farms where they're not being poisoned, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, that's one of the best things with biodynamic farms. They are so happy. In fact, for those of you who are familiar with biodynamics, we could say that the biodynamic preparations are food for the elemental beings. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
My dears. All right. We will close for this evening, and I will send out in an hour or two the link to the video for you and others, and also a copy of this poem that I spoke for you. And I hope to see you next week. Thank you very much. And if you're interested in the eurythmy on Tuesday mornings, it really, yeah, they like to go hand in hand. Thank you so much. And please, dear friends, acknowledge Michelle, who has been helping class in this whole journey with me. Thank you so much. All right.
And
Good
thank
night, people.
you.
Good night.
Good night.
Yeah.